Sometimes the most important moments in our lives arrive when we're simply trying to buy a horse. There are few things more heartbreaking than watching innocents suffer while good people stand by and do nothing. In 9th century Norway, Einar Ironhand was a giant of a man who had seen enough bloodshed for 3 lifetimes. He walked into a stable in Skallvik, expecting to purchase a horse and ride home. Instead, he found a young slave girl named Alva, chained like an animal, beaten and broken. The trader offered to sell her for less than the price of a saddle. Einar broke her chains with his bare hands and carried her to safety. What started as one act of mercy became something much bigger. Together, this unlikely pair began freeing slaves across the northern territories, dismantling the most powerful slave networks in the fjords. But how did a former slave become the mastermind behind hundreds of rescues? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to the fjord like the breath of sleeping giants. And Einar Ironhand stood at the edge of his land, watching the sun paint the water gold. At 7 feet tall, with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway, he cast a shadow that seemed to swallow the rocky shore. His hands, scarred from decades of gripping sword hilts and war hammers, now held nothing more dangerous than a wooden cup of ale. 43 winters had passed since his birth, and each one had carved deeper lines into his weathered face. His beard, once the color of autumn wheat, now showed streaks of silver that caught the morning light. The other warriors in the region still spoke his name with a mixture of respect and wariness. Einar Ironhand, the man who had never lost a battle, who had stood shield to shield with kings and jarls across the northern lands, but those days felt like another man's memories now. His homestead sat nestled in a protected cove, 3 hours' ride from the nearest settlement. The main hall, built from massive pine logs and roofed with thick sod, could house 20 men comfortably. Now it sheltered only him, his aging housekeeper Ragnar, and the ghosts of choices he wished he could unmake. The walls bore no trophies of war, no captured shields or enemy weapons. Instead, simple wooden shelves held books traded from traveling. Merchants, stories and knowledge from distant lands. Einar had learned to read during long winter nights when sleep brought too many dreams of blood-soaked battlefields. Reading gave his mind something to grasp, besides the memories of men he'd killed, families he'd helped destroy, villages he'd seen burn to ash and smoke. The written word offered refuge in a way that ale and fighting never could. The war hammer that had earned him his name and his fearsome reputation now hung on pegs beside the hearth, its iron head dark with age and disuse. Ragnar cleaned it weekly out of habit, but Einar hadn't lifted it in battle for nearly 5 years. The weapon had been a gift from his father, forged by the finest smiths in their clan, its handle wrapped in leather worn smooth by his grip. It could crush a man's skull with a single blow or cave in a shield like parchment. He'd grown to hate the weight of it in his hands. The memories came anyway, unbidden and sharp as winter wind. The raid on the Saxon monastery where he'd killed 12 monks who'd never held a weapon. The village by the river where he'd watched his sword brothers burn homes with families still inside. The day he'd realized that the screaming women and children weren't so different from his own sister and her little ones back home. That was when something had broken inside him. Not his body, which remained as strong as an ox, but something deeper. His heart, perhaps, or his soul. 5 years ago he'd simply stopped, laid down his weapons, divided his share of the war spoils among his men, and walked away. Most warriors who retired from raiding did so because age had stolen their strength or injury had crippled them. Einar had quit at his peak when jarls still offered him gold and glory to lead their war bands. His former comrades thought he'd lost his mind. Perhaps he had. Now he raised cattle and sheep, worked his fields with the same methodical precision he'd once used to plan battles. The land didn't judge him for his past. It asked only for honest work, fair treatment and patience. In return, it provided everything he needed: food, shelter, purpose, and a kind of peace he'd never known during his fighting years. But peace, Einar had learned, could be as challenging as war. Without the constant threat of death to focus his mind, he found himself remembering things he'd spent years trying to forget. The faces of the people he'd hurt haunted his dreams and followed him through his daily routines. Sometimes, while mending fences or feeding livestock, he'd catch himself wondering what kind of man he might have been if he'd chosen a different path. The isolation helped, but it also amplified his thoughts. Days would pass without speaking to another soul except Ragnar, who'd worked for his family since before he was born. She was past 60 now, her hair white as fresh snow, her hands gnarled, but still capable of the finest cooking in 3 settlements. She never asked questions about his past, never pressed him to explain why he'd abandoned a warrior's life for a farmer's routine. Perhaps she understood that some wounds needed silence to heal. His nearest neighbor lived more than a day's ride away. Visitors were rare. The occasional traveling merchant, a messenger bringing news from the outside world, or one of his former sword brothers checking to see if he'd lost his mind completely. Most found him working in his fields or tending his animals, and left convinced that the greatest warrior of their generation had indeed gone soft in the head. They weren't entirely wrong, though not in the way they thought. The cattle lowed softly in their pen, reminding him that the day's work waited for no man's brooding. Einar finished his ale and made his way toward the barn, his boots crunching on frost that still lingered in the shadows despite the warming sun. The routine of caring for animals had become one of his greatest comforts. Their needs were simple, honest, and immediate. Feed them, provide fresh water, mend their shelter when it needed repair. They asked nothing about his past and forgave everything as long as he met their basic needs. But today felt different somehow. As he opened the barn doors and breathed in the familiar scents of hay and leather, something nagged at the edge of his consciousness. Perhaps it was the dream he'd had the night before, not the usual nightmares of battle and bloodshed, but something stranger. A vision of chains breaking, of a woman's voice calling for help, of his own hands doing something other than destroying. He dismissed it upon waking, but the feeling lingered like smoke from a dying fire. His best mare, Saga, had thrown a shoe 3 days ago, and the nearest blacksmith lived in Skallvik, a half-day's journey south along the coastal road. He'd been putting off the trip, content to let her rest in the paddock while he used his ox cart for the heavier farm work. But Saga was getting restless, and the weather looked favorable for travel. More importantly, he needed supplies that only a proper trading post could provide: salt for preserving meat, iron nails for repairs, perhaps a new axe head if the smith had quality work available. Living so far from civilization meant planning carefully for such trips. He wouldn't make this journey again before winter, so he needed to purchase everything his household would require for the coming months. Ragnar had prepared a list written in her careful script, marking quantities beside each item. Her literacy was one of many things that set her apart from most women of her age and station. She'd learned from the same monks who'd taught Einar's mother years ago, back when his family still maintained friendly relations with the Christian holy men who'd built a small chapel near their lands. Those monks were all dead now, killed in raids Einar himself had led. Another weight to carry. The journey to Skallvik would take him through country he'd helped conquer and pacify during his war years. Every hill and valley held memories of skirmishes, ambushes, and pitched battles. The scars on the landscape had healed, but his own remained fresh and tender. Still, the practical needs of his household demanded action. Regardless of his personal discomfort, he spent the morning preparing for travel, checking his horse's gear, packing supplies for the journey, counting out silver coins for his purchases. Ragnar insisted on wrapping food for the road, more than he could possibly need for such a short trip. Her motherly fussing both annoyed and comforted him, a reminder of gentler aspects of human nature he'd nearly forgotten during his fighting years. "The roads aren't safe for solitary travelers," she warned, as she did before every journey. There are bandits and worse things roaming the hills. Einar nodded seriously, though they both knew that any bandit stupid enough to attack him would regret the decision quickly. Even without armor or weapons beyond a simple traveling knife, his size and bearing marked him as dangerous. Most predators preferred easier prey, but Ragnar's concern touched him. After decades of warriors who saw him only as a weapon to be pointed at their enemies, having someone worry about his safety felt strange and precious. He'd grown protective of their quiet domestic routine, the way she'd scold him for tracking mud through the house or insist he eat proper meals instead of gnawing on bread and cheese while working. As the sun reached its peak, Einar saddled his traveling horse, a sturdy gelding bred for endurance rather than speed. He strapped his purchases list and coin purse to his belt, checked that his knife was secure in its sheath, and mounted up. The road to Skallvik stretched ahead, winding through forests of pine and birch before opening onto the coastal plain where the trading settlement sat. He had no way of knowing that this simple errand would shatter his carefully constructed peace forever. Skallvik sprawled along the shoreline like a collection of driftwood scattered by high tide. The settlement had grown considerably since Einar's last visit 2 summers ago. New buildings clustered around the harbor, and the permanent population seemed to have doubled. Ships from distant lands bobbed at anchor, their foreign crews haggling with local merchants over goods that would travel hundreds of miles before reaching their final destinations. The air hung thick with the mingled scents of tar, fish, leather, and unwashed humanity. Smoke from countless fires created a hazy canopy above the settlement, and the constant noise of commerce, shouting traders, creaking cartwheels, lowing livestock, assaulted ears accustomed to the peaceful silence of isolated homesteads. Einar guided his horse through the muddy streets with practiced caution, avoiding the worst of the ruts and the piles of refuse that marked every intersection. Children darted between the legs of pack animals, while their mothers called warnings from doorways. Dogs fought over scraps in the shadows between buildings, and merchants hawked their wares with voices hoarse from constant use. The blacksmith's forge glowed red-hot at the settlement's eastern edge, where the prevailing winds would carry smoke away from the main buildings. Einar dismounted and led his horse toward the familiar ring of hammer on anvil, metal sparks dancing like fireflies in the dim workshop. The smith, a barrel-chested man named Thorkel, looked up from his work and grinned recognition. Einar Ironhand. Thought you'd sworn off civilization entirely. My mare threw a shoe, Einar replied, patting the animal's neck. And I need supplies before winter sets in. Thorkel examined the horse's hoof with expert hands, nodding approval at the quality of the remaining shoes. Good ironwork. Give me an hour, and she'll be sound as new stone. There's ale in the pot if you're thirsty. While Thorkel worked, Einar wandered through the settlement's market area, checking items off Ragnar's list. Salt cost more than expected. The traders claimed rough seas had delayed shipments from the southern coasts. Iron nails were available, but of questionable quality. He'd need to examine each one carefully to avoid purchasing metal that would bend or break under normal use. The axe heads displayed by the weaponsmith caught his eye with their clean lines and sharp edges. But when he lifted one to test its balance, memories of splitting enemy shields flooded back with unwelcome clarity. His hand trembled almost imperceptibly as he set the tool back down and moved away without making a purchase. These episodes were becoming more frequent. Objects that should have been simple tools triggered vivid recollections of violence and death. Sometimes the memories were so intense that he felt transported back to ancient battlefields, surrounded by the screams of dying men and the metallic stench of spilled blood. The episodes passed quickly, but they left him shaken and reminded him why he'd chosen isolation over the company of other people. By afternoon, he'd completed most of his purchasing and arranged for the goods to be loaded onto his pack horse. Thorkel had finished shoeing Saga, who pranced impatiently while her owner settled the bill. All that remained was purchasing a replacement for his aging cart. Horse, the animal that pulled his plow and hauled firewood, was showing signs of advanced years, and would likely not survive. Another hard winter, Bjorn the trader keeps the finest horses in 3 settlements, Thorkel suggested when Einar explained his need. His stable is behind the grain warehouse near the harbour. Tell him I sent you, and he might deal fairly. Einar thanked the blacksmith and made his way toward the waterfront, following directions through increasingly narrow streets. The buildings here were older and more ramshackle, some leaning against their neighbours for support. The smell of the harbour, rotting fish, seaweed and human waste, grew stronger with each step. Bjorn's stable proved easy to locate by the sounds of horses and the pungent odour of manure. The building itself was larger than most in the settlement, constructed from ship timbers and roofed with overlapping planks that had been tarred against the weather. A painted sign above the door depicted a horse's head alongside runic script proclaiming the owner's name and trade. Einar pushed open the heavy wooden door and stepped into the dim interior. Sunlight filtered through gaps between the wall planks, creating bars of golden illumination across the straw-covered floor. A dozen horses occupied stalls along both sides of the central aisle, ranging from sturdy cart animals to sleek riding mounts that would cost more than a farmer's annual income. "Back here," called a voice from the stable's rear. "Looking for something particular?" Einar followed the voice deeper into the building, past stalls containing animals of various breeds and temperaments. Some wicked greetings as he passed, while others watched him with the wary intelligence of creatures who'd learned to be suspicious of human intentions. He found Bjorn the trader examining the hoof of a massive draft horse. His attention focused entirely on his work. The man was shorter than average, but built like a tree stump, with arms thick as ship's masts and hands that could probably crush walnuts. His clothing marked him as prosperous, good wool dyed in expensive colors, silver arm rings that caught the light when he moved. "Need a cart horse," Einar said simply. "Something that can pull a plough and haul timber." Bjorn looked up, and his eyes widened slightly as he took in Einar's size and bearing. "You're the one they call Ironhand. Heard you'd gone soft, farming like a thrall." The insult stung more than Einar cared to admit, but he kept his expression neutral. "Do you have animals for sale or not?" "Aye, I've got what you need." Bjorn gestured toward the back of the stable. "Strong beasts, good bloodlines. But they'll cost you proper silver, not promises." They moved past barrels of grain and coils of rope toward the stable's darkest corner. Einar's attention focused on examining the horses Bjorn indicated, a pair of sturdy mares that looked capable of the heavy work his farm required. But as they negotiated price and bloodlines, something else caught his peripheral vision. Behind a pile of broken yokes and discarded harness leather, something pale moved in the shadows. Einar's warrior instincts, dulled by years of peaceful farming, suddenly sharpened to razor clarity. His hand moved unconsciously toward his knife as his eyes adjusted to the deeper gloom. What he saw made his blood turn cold as winter seawater. A young woman crouched against the stable's back wall, iron shackles around her wrists and ankles connected by a heavy chain. Her dress, once probably white or pale yellow, was now stained with dirt and worse things. Dark bruises marked her face and arms, some fresh and purple, others faded to sick yellow-green. She was thin to the point of starvation, her collarbones standing out sharply beneath skin that had never seen enough sunlight, but her eyes held an intelligence and defiance that all the beatings in the world hadn't managed to break. She looked directly at him for one moment that seemed to stretch into eternity. No pleading, no tears, just a level gaze that seemed to measure his soul and find it wanting. Then she looked away, as if his attention was just another burden to bear. "What?" Einar's voice came out as a croak. He cleared his throat and tried again. "What is that?" Bjorn glanced over casually, as if just remembering the girl's existence. "Oh, her. Slave girl. Came in on a ship from the eastern raids. No family to ransom her, so she's for sale." He scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Pretty little thing, or was, before she started being difficult. Fought like a wildcat when they brought her in. Had to beat some sense into her." "You're selling her?" The words felt like ash in Einar's mouth. "Everything's for sale at the right price." She'd make a decent house slave once properly trained. Good breeding, can read and write, speaks 3 languages. The captain who brought her said she was some jarl's daughter before his hall got burned out. Bjorn shrugged. Fortunes of war, you know how it is. Einar knew exactly how it was. He'd participated in dozens of raids that had created girls, exactly like this one. Daughters of defeated enemies, dragged from their homes to be sold like livestock in distant markets. He'd told himself they were just the cost of war, the price of victory, the natural order of things. Looking at this particular girl, chained in this particular stable, he could no longer hide behind such justifications. How much? The question slipped out before he could stop himself. Bjorn's eyebrows rose. For the slave? 15 silver marks. She's damaged goods, but still has some use left in her. 15 silver marks. Less than the cost of a decent saddle. Less than what Einar had paid for his traveling horse. The price of a human life, reduced to simple arithmetic. I'll take her, Einar heard himself saying. And one of those mares. The words felt disconnected from his will, as if someone else was speaking through his mouth. But once spoken, they could not be taken back. And somewhere in the depths of his chest, something that had been frozen for years began, slowly, to thaw. The transaction took place with the same casual efficiency as purchasing livestock. Bjorn produced a leather pouch and counted out silver coins, while Einar stood frozen, watching the girl who had just become his property. She hadn't moved from her position against the wall, but he could see her shoulders tense as the men discussed her fate in words she clearly understood. Chain stays with her, Bjorn said, tucking the coins into his belt. Iron's good quality, worth a mark by itself. You'll want to keep her secured until she accepts her situation. Took 3 men to drag her off the ship. Einar nodded absently, his mind struggling to process what he'd just done. 5 minutes ago, he'd been a peaceful farmer making routine purchases. Now he owned another human being, a responsibility he'd never wanted and had no idea how to handle. The weight of it settled on his shoulders like a wet cloak. Keys are in the tack room, Bjorn continued, leading them toward a small side chamber filled with bridles and rope. Previous owner said she bites, so watch your fingers when you feed her. Learned that lesson the hard way himself. The trader rummaged through a wooden box until he found an iron key, black with age and wear. He tossed it to Einar, who caught it reflexively. The metal felt cold against his palm, heavier than its size suggested. What's her name? Einar asked. Alva, I think. Some northern name her people used. Might answer to it if you're lucky. Bjorn shrugged as if the detail was unimportant. Of course, you can call her whatever you want. She's yours now. Einar walked back to where Alva waited, each step feeling like he was crossing some invisible threshold from which there would be no return. Up close, the evidence of her mistreatment was even more apparent. Someone had struck her recently. Her lower lip was split and swollen, and finger-shaped bruises marked her throat, where hands had gripped too tightly. She looked up as his shadow fell across her, and for a moment their eyes met again. Hers were grey-green, the colour of seawater under storm clouds. There was no hope in them, no gratitude for her change in ownership. Just a weary resignation that spoke of suffering too deep for tears. I'm going to unlock these, Einar said quietly, holding up the key. Don't run. There's nowhere to go. Alva gave the slightest nod, more acknowledgement than agreement. When he knelt beside her to work the locks, she remained perfectly still, except for the almost imperceptible trembling in her hands. The shackles had worn raw patches on her wrists and ankles, some infected and weeping. How long had she been chained like this? The iron cuffs fell away with soft clicks that seemed unnaturally loud in the stable's dim interior. Alva flexed her fingers slowly, as if testing whether her limbs still belonged to her. Dark impressions marked her skin where the metal had rested, likely permanent reminders of this captivity. Can you walk? Einar asked. She tested her weight on unsteady legs, using the wall for support. Her movements were careful and deliberate, like someone relearning how to use her own body. When she took a step forward, she stumbled slightly before catching herself. The horses are ready, Bjorn called from the front of the stable. You want help loading your purchases? Einar gathered the discarded chains, their weight surprising him. How had she managed to move at all while carrying such a burden? He tucked the shackles into his pack, though he couldn't say why. Perhaps as evidence of what he'd witnessed, or maybe as a reminder of his own complicity in the system that had created this moment. The late afternoon sun felt harsh after the stable's dim interior. Alva squinted and raised one hand to shield her eyes, suggesting she'd been kept in darkness for some time. Her pale skin showed the unhealthy pallor of someone deprived of natural light. Another small cruelty in what must have been an endless series of them. Einar's pack horse stood loaded with his day's purchases, while Saga waited patiently nearby. The new cart mare, a sturdy brown animal with intelligent eyes, completed his small caravan. But now he faced a practical problem he hadn't considered during his impulsive decision in the stable. How exactly did one transport a freed slave? Alva solved the dilemma by approaching Saga and standing beside the horse's flank, clearly expecting to walk. The thought of making her travel on foot for half a day, given her obvious weakness and injuries, struck Einar as unconscionably cruel. But the alternative, sharing his saddle with a stranger, presented its own complications. "You'll ride," he decided. "I'll walk." He dismounted and held Saga's reins while Alva approached. The horse, accustomed to his gentle handling, stood calmly as the girl placed one hand on the saddle. But when she tried to mount, her weakened legs gave way and she nearly fell. Without thinking, Einar caught her around the waist and lifted her onto the horse's back. She weighed almost nothing, her body light as bird bones beneath his hands. The contact lasted only seconds, but he felt her flinch at his touch, every muscle tensing as if expecting violence. "I won't hurt you," he said softly. Stepping back to give her space, Alva said nothing, but her hands gripped the saddle horn with white knuckles. Whether from fear of falling or fear of him, Einar couldn't tell. Perhaps both. The journey home began in uncomfortable silence. Einar led Saga by the reins, while the pack horse and cart mare followed on lead ropes. His long stride covered ground efficiently, but he found himself checking on Alva every few minutes, watching for signs that she might faint or fall from the saddle. She rode like someone accustomed to horses, her posture naturally balanced despite her obvious exhaustion. Another piece of evidence supporting Bjorn's claim about her noble background. A Jarl's daughter would have learned horsemanship from childhood, the skill so ingrained that it survived even the trauma of captivity and abuse. As they left Skallvik behind and entered the forested hills, Einar's mind wrestled with the magnitude of what he'd done. In the space of an afternoon, he'd fundamentally altered the careful routine that had given his life structure and purpose for the past 5 years. The peaceful isolation he'd cultivated was shattered beyond repair, but what choice had he had? Walking away and leaving her chained in that stable would have been another kind of violence, a betrayal of whatever remained decent in his character. He'd committed too many sins during his warrior years to add abandoning an innocent victim to the list. The problem was that good intentions didn't automatically translate into good outcomes. He had no experience caring for traumatized captives, no knowledge of how to help someone heal from such profound mistreatment. His own emotional wounds were still raw after years of attempted healing. How could he possibly help another person find peace when he'd barely found it himself? The sun was sinking toward the western hills when they stopped at a small stream to rest the horses. Alva dismounted carefully, moving like an old woman despite her youth. When Einar offered her water cupped in his hands, she drank gratefully, but kept her eyes downcast, avoiding direct eye contact. "We're almost there," he told her, though she hadn't asked. "It's a good place. Safe." She nodded without speaking, and he wondered if trauma had stolen her voice or if she simply chose silence as protection against further pain. Time would tell, he supposed. Time and patience, neither of which had ever been his greatest virtues. As darkness gathered around them, Einar helped Alva back onto the horse and resumed their journey. Ahead lay his homestead, his sanctuary of peace and solitude. Behind them lay a life that neither of them could ever fully escape. Ragnar was kneading bread when they arrived, her weathered hands working the dough with practiced rhythm. Through the open door of the main hall, warm light spilled across the courtyard, carrying with it the comforting scents of yeast and wood smoke. The elderly woman looked up at the sound of approaching horses, her face brightening with relief at Einar's safe return. Then she saw Alva, the housekeeper's hands stilled mid-motion, flour dusting her knuckles as she took in the sight of the injured girl, swaying in the saddle. Her sharp eyes missed nothing: the torn clothing, the visible bruises, the way Alva held herself like someone expecting another blow. Ragnar had seen enough in her long life to recognize the aftermath of cruelty. "Blessed Mother of Mercy," she whispered, wiping her hands on her apron. "What have you brought home?" Einar helped Alva dismount, steadying her when her legs nearly buckled. "Her name is Alva. She needs food, clean clothes, and a place to sleep." "And healing," Ragnar added, approaching slowly with the careful movements one used around wounded animals. "Child, when did you last eat?" Alva's response was so quiet that Einar barely heard it. 3 days, maybe 4. The number hit him like a physical blow. While he'd been debating the purchase of horses and farm supplies, this girl had been starving in the darkness of a stable, surviving on scraps or nothing at all. The casual brutality of it made his stomach clench with something that might have been shame. Ragnar took charge with the efficiency of someone accustomed to managing crises. "Get her inside before she collapses. I'll prepare a bath and something gentle for her stomach. Broth and bread, nothing too rich until we see how she handles it." The main hall felt cavernous after the close confines of the stable. A fire crackled in the central hearth, its warmth reaching into every corner of the room. Tapestries hung from the walls, depicting scenes of daily life rather than battles or conquests. Einar guided Alva to a chair near the fire, noting how her eyes darted around the space as if cataloguing potential threats or escape routes. "This is my home," he said, settling into the chair across from her. "You're safe here." Alva nodded but remained tense, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The firelight revealed the full extent of her injuries. Bruises at various stages of healing, small cuts that had scabbed over, the raw chafing where the shackles had worn her skin. Someone had hurt her systematically, repeatedly, with the kind of deliberate cruelty that required both imagination and complete disregard for human suffering. Ragnar bustled about the kitchen area, heating water and preparing food with the focused intensity she brought to any task. Occasionally, she glanced toward Alva with an expression of maternal concern that reminded Einar why he'd kept the old woman on long after he could have managed the household alone. She possessed a capacity for kindness that his warrior's heart had almost forgotten existed. "The bath is ready," Ragnar announced, ladling steaming water into a wooden tub behind a screen in the corner. "There are clean clothes laid out, and soap that won't sting the cuts too badly." When Alva didn't immediately respond, Einar realized she was waiting for permission. The thought made his chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't quite name. How thoroughly had her spirit been broken that she needed approval for basic human needs? "Go ahead," he said gently. "Take as long as you need." Alva rose unsteadily and made her way toward the bathing area. Ragnar followed, her voice dropping to the soothing tones she'd once used to comfort Einar's childhood nightmares. Behind the screen, he heard quiet conversation and the gentle splash of water, punctuated by Ragnar's occasional murmurs of sympathy. Einar used the time to stable his horses and unload his purchases. The mundane tasks helped calm his racing thoughts, though questions continued to multiply in his mind. What was he supposed to do with Alva now? She was legally his property, but the very concept made his skin crawl. He could free her, of course, but freedom without resources or protection was often just another form of death sentence. When he returned to the hall, Alva sat by the fire wearing one of Ragnar's old dresses, her damp hair combed back from her face. The warm bath had brought some color to her cheeks, and without the grime of captivity, she looked younger than he'd first thought. 17, perhaps 18, barely more than a child. Despite the adult horrors she'd endured, a bowl of broth steamed on the table beside her, along with a small piece of bread torn into manageable portions. She ate slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned that food could be snatched away at any moment. Each spoonful was a deliberate act, savored rather than consumed. The water was black when she finished, Ragnar murmured to Einar, her voice pitched low enough that Alva couldn't hear. Poor thing hasn't been properly clean in weeks, maybe months. And those marks on her wrists, I saw them, Einar interrupted, not wanting to hear the details spoken aloud. Knowing about them was burden enough without adding Ragnar's clinical assessment of the damage. She'll need time, the housekeeper continued. Trust doesn't come back quickly after it's been broken so thoroughly. But she's strong, this one. I can see it in her eyes. Einar looked across the room at Alva, who was methodically working her way through the simple meal. Her movements were precise and controlled, suggesting someone who'd learned to mask their true thoughts and feelings as a matter of survival. But occasionally, when she thought no one was watching, her gaze would drift around the room with an intelligence that evaluated everything she saw. "Where will she sleep?" he asked. "The small chamber off the kitchen," Ragnar replied. "It has its own entrance and can be barred from the inside. She'll feel safer with her own space, at least at first." The practicality of the arrangement highlighted how little Einar understood about caring for someone who'd been traumatized. Ragnar's instinctive grasp of Alva's needs made him grateful once again for the old woman's presence. Left to his own devices, he might have made well-intentioned mistakes that could have caused more harm. As the evening wore on, they maintained a careful routine of normalcy. Ragnar worked at her spinning wheel, the rhythmic whisper of thread a soothing counterpoint to the fire's crackle. Einar carved a new handle for a tool that had broken, his knife working the wood with patient precision. And Alva finished her meal in small, measured bites, her stomach clearly unused to regular food. When she finally set down the empty bowl, Einar felt a small surge of relief. Getting proper nutrition into her was the first step toward healing, though he suspected the physical recovery would prove far easier than the emotional one. "Thank you," Alva said quietly, her voice carrying the cultured accent of someone well-educated. "For the food. She gestured vaguely around the room. "All of this. You don't need to thank me," Einar replied, though her words caused something warm to unfurl in his chest. "This is your home now, for as long as you want it to be." Alva nodded, but said nothing more. Soon after, Ragnar helped her to the small chamber that would serve as her refuge, showing her how to work the door bar and where to find extra blankets if the night turned cold. Alone by the dying fire, Einar reflected on the day's events with a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. He'd acted on instinct in that stable, driven by something deeper than rational thought. Now he had to live with the consequences of that choice, whatever they might prove to be. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and sending sparks dancing up the chimney. Winter was coming, as it always did, but this year would be different. This year, he wouldn't face the darkness alone. The first weeks passed in careful steps, like dancers learning an unfamiliar rhythm. Alva rose before dawn each morning and helped Ragnar with the household tasks, her movements efficient despite the lingering weakness in her limbs. She spoke only when spoken to, kept her eyes downcast in Einar's presence, and retired early to her small chamber each evening. But beneath the surface compliance, Einar sensed something watchful and calculating. He'd catch glimpses of it when Alva thought herself unobserved, the way her gaze lingered on the placement of tools, how she tested the weight of kitchen knives while helping prepare meals, the careful attention she paid to the routines and rhythms of the household. She was studying them, learning their patterns, whether for escape or some other purpose he couldn't determine. The physical healing progressed steadily under Ragnar's ministrations. The infected wounds on Alva's wrists and ankles responded to careful cleaning and herbal poultices. The bruises faded from purple to yellow to nothing, and proper food began to fill out her gaunt frame. But the emotional wounds ran deeper, manifesting in startled flinches when someone moved too quickly, nightmares that had her crying out in languages Einar didn't recognize, and a persistent wariness that never quite left her eyes. 3 weeks after her arrival, Einar found her in the barn, methodically grooming Saga with strokes that betrayed years of experience with horses. The mare stood perfectly still, clearly enjoying the attention, while Alva worked the curry comb through the animal's winter coat. "She likes you," Einar observed, approaching slowly to avoid startling either horse or girl. "Horses are honest," Alva replied without looking up. "They don't lie about their intentions." The comment carried implications that made Einar's chest tighten. "Are you saying people do?" "In my experience, yes." She moved to Saga's other side, her movements fluid and confident around the large animal. "Your housekeeper is kind. She reminds me of my grandmother, before the raids came." It was the most personal information she'd shared since arriving. Einar filed it away, another piece in the puzzle of who she'd been before captivity stripped away her former identity. "What happened to your family?" he asked gently, Alva's hand stilled on the brush. For a long moment, the only sound was Saga's gentle breathing and the rustle of straw beneath their feet. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the flat tone of someone recounting a distant tragedy. "My father was Jarl Eriksson of the Western Fjords. Our hall had stood for 5 generations, passed down from grandfather to son to son. We thought ourselves secure." She resumed brushing, the rhythm steady and methodical. "The attack came at harvest time, when most of our warriors were in the fields. They burned everything, the hall, the village, the grain stores. My parents died defending the threshold. My younger brothers tried to run. She didn't need to finish." Einar could imagine the rest with sickening clarity, having participated in similar raids during his warrior years. The systematic destruction of enemy holdings, the killing of adult males to prevent future vengeance, the capture of women and children for the slave markets. He'd told himself it was simply warfare, the natural order of things. Standing in his peaceful barn, watching this broken girl tend to his horse. Those old justifications crumbled to ash. How many did they take? He found himself asking. 43 women and children. The number came without hesitation, burned into her memory. I counted them as we were loaded onto the ship. By the time we reached the first trading port, 7 had died from wounds or sickness. At the second port, they sold the children to different buyers. I never saw them again. Einar leaned against the stall door, feeling suddenly exhausted. "And the others?" "Scattered across the northern lands, I suppose. Sold to whoever offered the best price." Alva set down the brush and scratched behind Saga's ears. "Some might have found kind masters who treated them well. Others," she shrugged, "others were not so fortunate." The casual way she spoke of systematic brutality made it worse somehow, as if she'd been forced to accept horror as routine. How many times had he participated in creating such tragedies without sparing a thought for the individual stories of loss and suffering? "I'm sorry," he said, though the words felt inadequate. "For what?" Alva looked at him directly for the first time in days. "You didn't burn my father's hall or kill my family. You weren't on the ship that carried me into slavery." Her grey-green eyes held no accusation, which somehow made her next words cut deeper. "You just bought me from a trader like you'd buy a horse or a cow." The truth of it hit him like a physical blow. For all his self-congratulation about rescuing her from Bjorn's stable, he'd still participated in the very system that had destroyed her life. The silver he'd paid had validated the trader's business, encouraged him to acquire more human merchandise for future sales. "I could free you," Einar offered. "Give you papers declaring you a free woman." "And then what?" Alva's voice carried no bitterness, just practical assessment. "I have no family, no allies, no resources. A freed slave woman alone in this world is just prey waiting for the next predator. At least here I'm fed and sheltered." The bleak calculation behind her words made Einar's stomach clench. She was right, of course. Legal freedom without power or protection was often meaningless, especially for someone who'd already been victimized by the system once. Simply declaring her free would be an empty gesture that might actually put her in more danger. "There has to be another way," he said. For the first time since her arrival, Alva smiled, a small, sardonic expression that transformed her face completely. "You truly believe that, don't you?" That there's always a solution if you just think hard enough about it, don't you? I used to. She picked up the brush again and returned to grooming Saga. My father taught me that every problem has an answer if you approach it from the right angle. He said it was a matter of seeing clearly, thinking strategically, and acting decisively. What changed your mind? Reality. The word carried the weight of bitter experience. Some problems don't have solutions, Einar Ironhand. Some systems are too big and too entrenched to fight. The slave trade has existed for centuries. It will continue long after we're both dead. Maybe, Einar admitted. But that doesn't mean we can't help individual people escape it. Alva paused in her brushing to study his face. Individual people like me, you mean? Like you? Like the others you mentioned? The 43 from your village? Like all the people currently chained in stables and market squares across the Northern Territories? Something flickered in her eyes. Interest, perhaps, or calculation. That would require more than good intentions. What would it require? Knowledge of how the trade works, who the major dealers are, where they keep their merchandise, how they transport captives from place to place. Her voice took on a different quality, sharper and more focused. You'd need reliable information about upcoming sales, ship schedules, guard rotations. And you'd need resources, silver for bribes or purchases, weapons for the times when money isn't enough. Safe houses where freed slaves could recover before moving on. Einar listened with growing amazement as she outlined the logistics of what would essentially be a war against the slave trade. Her analysis was thorough, practical, and devastatingly clear. This wasn't the desperate dreaming of a victim. Seeking revenge, it was strategic. Thinking of the highest caliber, you've given this considerable thought, he observed. I've had time to think. Alva resumed her methodical brushing. Long days and longer nights with nothing to do but plan scenarios that would never happen. Why would they never happen? Because I'm one person with no power, no allies, and no resources. She glanced at him sideways. Though I suppose that might have changed recently. The implication hung in the air between them, like smoke from a distant fire. Was she suggesting what he thought she was suggesting? It would be dangerous, he said slowly. Everything worthwhile is dangerous. We could both end up dead or enslaved. Ourselves. Better than doing nothing while others suffer, Einar. Found himself nodding before he'd fully processed the magnitude of what they were discussing. Where would we start? For the second time that day, Alva smiled. But this expression was different from the first. Predatory rather than sardonic, like a wolf catching the scent of prey. We start by gathering information, she said. And for that, we'll need to return to Skallvik. Ragnar listened to their plan, with the stoic expression of someone who'd watched young people make dangerous decisions for more years than she cared to count. When they finished explaining their intentions, she set down her mending and fixed them both with a look that could have frozen summer ale. You're talking about declaring war on half the traders in the Northern Territories, she said flatly. Men who have gold, connections, and enough hired swords to level this homestead if they decide you're a threat. We're talking about freeing innocent people, Alva replied, though her respectful tone showed deference to the older woman's concerns. People who didn't choose their circumstances. And I'm talking about reality. Ragnar picked up her needle again, her movements sharp with agitation. You think you're the first to be horrified by the slave trade? You think good-hearted people haven't tried to fight it before? They're all dead now, or worse. Einar leaned forward in his chair. What would you have us do instead? Pretend we never saw what's happening? Go back to our peaceful farming and ignore the suffering? Yes, Ragnar said bluntly. Exactly that. You've found peace here, both of you. Don't throw it away chasing dreams of heroism. The harsh words stung because they contained a grain of truth. Einar had built something valuable in his isolated homestead, a refuge from the violence and moral compromise that had defined his earlier life. Was he willing to sacrifice that hard-won tranquility for what might prove to be a futile gesture? But when he looked at Alva, sitting straight-backed in her chair with fire dancing in her eyes, he knew the decision was already made. She tasted the possibility of action, of striking back against the system that had destroyed her family and stolen her freedom. He couldn't ask her to swallow that hope and return to passive acceptance of injustice. "We'll be careful," he promised Ragnar. "No unnecessary risks, no grand gestures. Just small actions where we can make a difference." The old woman snorted. "Small actions have a way of growing larger than intended. Mark my words, this path leads to grief for all of us." Despite her objections, Ragnar spent the following days helping them prepare for the return journey to Skallvik. She mended Einar's traveling clothes with extra care, packed more food than they could possibly need, and taught Alva additional healing techniques for treating common injuries. Her disapproval was clear, but her love for them both was stronger than her fears. The plan they'd developed was deceptively simple. Einar would return to Skallvik as a potential buyer, someone interested in purchasing additional laborers for his expanding farm operations. Alva would accompany him disguised as his current slave, a role that made them all uncomfortable, but provided the best cover for gathering intelligence. About the local trade, the key is to seem casually interested, Alva explained as they practiced their roles. Too eager and they'll become suspicious. Not interested enough and they won't share useful information. We need to find the balance between curiosity and indifference. Her understanding of deception and manipulation troubled Einar, though he recognized its necessity for their mission. Where had a Jarl's daughter learned such skills? Perhaps noble upbringing included more practical education than he'd realized, or perhaps trauma had taught her lessons no child should need to know. They departed on a grey morning, when frost still silvered the grass and their breath formed clouds in the cold air. This time Einar wore his best travelling clothes, wool dyed in rich colours, silver arm rings that caught the weak sunlight, leather boots that marked him as a man of substance. The transformation from simple farmer to prosperous landowner was subtle but complete. Alva rode behind him on a lead rope, playing the part of valuable property being transported by its owner. They'd practiced the dynamic during several short rides around the homestead, learning to maintain the fiction of master and slave, while secretly coordinating their observations and intelligence gathering. The journey passed in tense silence, both of them acutely aware of the dangers they were courting. If anyone recognized Alva from her previous captivity, their deception would collapse instantly. If Einar's true intentions became known, they might find themselves chained alongside the very people they hoped to help. Skallvik looked different through the lens of their mission. What had seemed like a bustling trading center on Einar's previous visit now revealed itself as something more sinister, a hub in a network of human misery that stretched across the known world. Every ship in the harbor might carry captive cargo. Every merchant's smile might hide the casual cruelty of someone who profited from suffering. They began with the taverns, where ale loosened tongues and traders shared information about profitable opportunities. Einar played his part well, presenting himself as a successful farmer seeking to expand his operations through the acquisition of skilled laborers. He bought drinks for strangers, listened to boastful stories of successful raids and profitable sales, and gradually steered conversations toward the specifics of the local trade. Alva, meanwhile, served as living proof of his success as a slave owner. Her well-fed appearance and clean clothing suggested someone who treated his property with care, an important detail for traders who wanted their merchandise to maintain its value. She kept her eyes downcast and spoke only when directly addressed, but her ears captured every whispered conversation, every casual reference to upcoming shipments or stored inventory. By the end of their first day, they'd learned that Bjorn, the trader, was small-scale compared to the larger operators. 3 major dealers dominated the regional market, each controlling different aspects of the supply chain. Grimmer, the shipmaster, handled transportation, moving captives between distant territories on vessels specifically modified for human cargo. Ragnar Goldtooth operated the largest holding facilities, temporary prisons where slaves were kept before sale. and Thorstein the broker managed distribution, matching buyers with appropriate merchandise and arranging complex multi-party transactions. They worked together but maintained separate operations, Alva summarized quietly as they shared a room at the settlement's inn that night. Competition keeps prices stable, while cooperation prevents the kind of territorial conflicts that would attract unwanted attention from local authorities. "Now, how many people are we talking about?" Einar asked. "Based on what I overheard, probably 200 captives moving through their system at any given time. Maybe more during peak season after the summer raids." Her voice remained calm and analytical, but he could see the tension in her shoulders. "Most are held in Ragnar's compounds outside the settlement, but the newest arrivals and the most valuable merchandise are kept in smaller facilities within Skallvik itself." The numbers were staggering. Einar had imagined they might help a handful of individuals escape their captivity. The reality was far larger and more complex than anything he'd envisioned. "Where do we start?" he asked. "With the children," Alva replied without hesitation. "They're kept separately from the adults, usually in the building behind the grain merchant's shop. Easier to guard, less likely to attempt escape, and they sell quickly to buyers who prefer young workers they can train to their specific needs." The matter-of-fact way she discussed the logistics of child slavery made Einar's hands clench into fists. But anger wouldn't help those children. Only careful planning and precise execution could offer them hope of freedom. "How many children?" he forced himself to ask. 15, maybe 20 at most. All between the ages of 8 and 14. Alva met his eyes directly. "Tomorrow we visit Ragnar's compound and see what other opportunities present themselves." As they settled into their respective sleeping areas, maintaining their fiction even in private, Einar reflected on how completely his life had changed in the space of a few weeks. The peaceful farmer was gone, replaced by someone planning operations that could save lives or get them both killed. He found, somewhat to his surprise, that he was looking forward to tomorrow's reconnaissance with an anticipation he hadn't felt in years. Ragnar's compound sprawled across several acres on the eastern outskirts of Skallvik, hidden from casual view by a grove of pine trees and a rise in the land that blocked sightlines from the main settlement. The facility was larger and more sophisticated than either Einar or Alva had anticipated. Multiple buildings surrounded by a high wooden palisade, with guard towers at the corners and what appeared to be separate quarters for different categories of captives. They approached openly, maintaining their cover as master and slave, investigating potential purchases. The guards at the gate recognized the type immediately. Prosperous landowners shopping for labor were common enough that their arrival drew no special attention. After a brief exchange of silver and pleasantries, they were escorted into the compound by a scarred veteran who introduced himself as Hakon. "Ragnar's in the Eastern Territories until next week," Hakon explained as he led them between the buildings. "But I handle most of the day-to-day sales anyway. What kind of workers are you looking for?" Einar had prepared for this question. "Farm laborers mainly, but I could use someone with household skills for my growing operations. My current slave," he gestured toward Alva, "has proven valuable enough that I'm considering expanding." Hakon glanced at Alva with the appraising eye of someone who understood human merchandise. "Good conditioning on that one. Healthy, well-trained. You treat your property well." The casual assessment made Einar's skin crawl, but he forced himself to nod appreciatively. Investment in their welfare pays dividends in productivity. As they toured the facility, the scope of the operation became clear. The main building housed approximately 60 adult captives, men and women separated by gender, but crowded into spaces barely adequate for half their number. The smell was overwhelming. Unwashed bodies, human waste, fear sweat that had soaked into the wooden walls over months or years of continuous use. A smaller building contained the children Alva had mentioned, their quarters marginally cleaner but no less cramped. They huddled together for warmth and comfort, their eyes holding the hollow look of young people who'd seen too much and lost too much. Several showed signs of recent illness, while others bore the marks of discipline that crossed the line into outright abuse. "These are promising," Einar managed to say, though his voice nearly cracked with the effort. "What are you asking for the group?" "Depends on which ones you want," Håkon replied, pulling out a leather-bound ledger. "The healthy boys command premium prices. They'll grow into strong laborers with proper training. The girls are popular with buyers who want kitchen help that won't tempt their sons or husbands." The clinical way he discussed children as market commodities pushed Einar dangerously close to abandoning his cover and reaching for the knife at his belt. Only Alva's subtle touch on his arm kept him focused on their mission. They were examining a third building when the unexpected happened. A commotion near the main gate drew their attention. Shouting voices, the sound of horses arriving at speed, and what sounded like someone barking orders with military precision. Håkon frowned and excused himself to investigate, leaving them momentarily alone among the captives. "That's not normal," Alva whispered, her face pale with sudden tension. Through the gaps between buildings, they could see armed men dismounting from exhausted horses. These weren't typical traders or guards. Their equipment was too good, their movements too disciplined, their bearing too confident. They moved like elite warriors accustomed to command and combat. Jarl's men, Einar realized with growing dread. Someone important enough to travel with a personal guard. The new arrivals were led toward the compound's main building, their leader visible now as a tall man in expensive furs, with silver threading his dark beard. Even at a distance, something about his profile seemed familiar to Einar, though he couldn't immediately place where he might have seen the man before. Then the stranger turned, and Einar's blood turned to ice water. Thorvald Bloodaxe, his former war chief and the closest thing to a friend he'd had during his raiding years. The man who'd taught him strategy, shared countless campfires with him, and once saved his life during a disastrous river crossing. Also the man whose brutal methods had finally convinced Einar to abandon the warrior's path. If Thorvald was here, it meant the slave trade had attracted the attention of the highest levels of Norse society. And if Thorvald saw Einar, their carefully constructed cover would evaporate faster than morning mist. "We need to leave," Einar said urgently, "right now." But as they turned toward the compound's exit, they found their path blocked by Håkon returning with 2 guards. The scarred man's expression had changed from casual friendliness to cold suspicion, and his hand rested on his sword hilt. "Seems we have an interesting situation," Håkon said slowly. "The Jarl's men are asking about a missing slave, a girl matching your property's description who escaped from a trading ship several months ago." Einar's heart hammered against his ribs, but he forced his expression to remain calm. "I purchased her legally from Bjorn the trader. I have witnesses to the transaction." "Oh, I don't doubt that," Håkon replied with a smile that held no warmth. "But the funny thing about escaped property is that it can be sold multiple times before the original owner catches up with it. Creates all sorts of legal complications." Alva stepped closer to Einar, her body language suggesting a frightened slave seeking her master's protection. But he could feel the tension coiled in her muscles, the predatory readiness of someone preparing for violence. "I'm sure we can resolve this misunderstanding," Einar said, reaching for his coin purse. "Perhaps a small fee to compensate for any inconvenience." "Perhaps," Håkon agreed, "though I think the Jarl's men might want to examine your property more closely first. Make sure she's who you claim she is." Through the gaps between buildings, they could see Thorvald's group approaching. In moments, the 2 groups would converge, and any chance of peaceful resolution would disappear. Einar's mind raced through possibilities, each one ending badly. That's when Alva acted. Her hand found a loose stone from the compound's walkway, and with a motion too quick to follow, she hurled it at one of the guards. The rock caught him squarely in the temple, dropping him instantly. Before anyone could react, she'd snatched the fallen man's sword and placed its point at Håkon's throat. "Nobody moves," she said in a voice that carried absolute authority. "Nobody calls for help. Nobody does anything except what I tell them to do." The transformation was so complete that Einar barely recognized her. Gone was the broken slave girl he'd rescued from Bjorn's stable. In her place stood someone who moved like a trained warrior and spoke with the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "This changes things considerably," Hakon observed, though he stood perfectly still with the blade at his neck. "It changes everything," Alva replied. "Einar, collect their weapons. Then we're going to walk very calmly toward the storage building where they keep the keys." "Alva, what are you—" "My name," she said without taking her eyes off Hakon, "is Alva Eriksdotter, daughter of Jarl Eriksson of the Western Fjords. And before my father's hall was burned, he spent considerable time teaching me strategy, swordplay, and the art of turning disadvantage into opportunity." The pieces clicked into place with stunning clarity. This wasn't a broken victim he'd rescued. It was a trained leader who'd been waiting for the right moment to strike back. She'd played the role of helpless slave so convincingly that even he'd been completely fooled. "You've been planning this all along," he realized. "Not this specifically," she admitted, applying gentle pressure to make Hakon step backward toward the storage building. "But something like it. I needed allies, resources, and the element of surprise. You provided the first two. Current circumstances have gifted us with the third. The compound has 20 guards," Hakon said quietly. "You can't fight your way out of here." "You're probably right," Alva agreed. "Which is why we're not going to fight. We're going to liberate every captive in this place and let them create enough chaos to cover our escape." She looked at Einar with eyes that held no trace of the frightened girl he'd comforted by his hearth. "Are you ready to find out what war against the slave trade actually looks like?" Behind them, shouts indicated that Thorvald's men had discovered the unconscious guard. They had perhaps minutes before the entire compound erupted into violence. Einar drew his knife and smiled grimly. "Lead the way, Jarl's daughter. Let's burn this place to the ground." The storage building held more than just keys. It contained the systematic documentation of human misery. Ledgers tracked the movement of captives like livestock inventory, recording ages, origins, physical condition, and estimated market value. Maps showed trade routes stretching across the known world, connecting dozens of settlements where human beings were bought and sold like grain or wool. And locked in wooden chests, they found enough silver to ransom a small kingdom. "This is bigger than we imagined," Einar breathed, scanning a ledger that detailed transactions involving nearly 1,000 people over the past year alone. "They're not just traders, they're running an empire." Alva worked methodically through the key ring Hakon had been forced to surrender, testing each one against the various locks until she found matches. Her movements remained calm and precise despite the shouts growing louder outside, suggesting that discovery was imminent. "The scale doesn't matter right now," she replied, tucking a handful of keys into her belt. "What matters is freeing as many people as we can before Thorvald's men organize a proper search." She paused at a detailed map showing the compound's layout, her finger tracing the locations of different buildings. "If we can open all the holding areas simultaneously, the guards won't be able to control the chaos. But we need to move fast. Once they realize what's happening, they'll start killing captives rather than let them escape." The cold calculation behind her words reminded Einar that he was dealing with someone who'd received formal training in tactics and strategy. Alva wasn't just seeking revenge for her own suffering. She was conducting a military operation with specific objectives and acceptable losses. "What about the children?" he asked. "They come with us," she said without hesitation. "The adults can choose their own paths, but the children need protection and guidance. We can't abandon them to fend for themselves." Outside, they could hear Thorvald's distinctive voice barking orders. The war chief had found the unconscious guard and was organizing a systematic search of the compound. Soon he'd discover that Hakon was missing, and the manhunt would intensify beyond anything they could hope to evade. "Time's up," Alva announced, shouldering a bag filled with silver coins and essential documents. "We do this now or not at all." They emerged from the storage building to find the compound in a state of controlled alertness. Guards were moving between buildings in organized patterns, checking locks and questioning the skeleton crew of workers who maintained the facility. But they hadn't yet realized that the keys to every cage and shackle were missing. Alva moved like smoke between the shadows, using her intimate knowledge of captivity to predict guard movements and find the blind spots in their surveillance. Einar followed, marveling at how completely she'd transformed from victim to predator in the space of minutes. Every gesture spoke of confidence earned through pain and training that ran deeper than mere instinct. The children's building was their first target. 23 young faces looked up as the door swung open, their expressions cycling through fear, hope, and confusion as they tried to process this unexpected development. Most had been captives long enough to learn that sudden changes usually meant suffering, not salvation. "Listen carefully," Alva said in a voice that carried absolute authority despite its gentle tone. "My name is Alva Eriksdottir. This is Einar Ironhand. We're here to take you home." A girl of perhaps 12, with the bearing of someone who'd been forced to grow up too quickly, stepped forward as the group's apparent leader. "Home to where?" "Most of our families are dead, then home to freedom," Alva replied. "But you have to trust us and do exactly what we tell you. Can you do that?" The girl studied both adults with eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. After a moment that felt like an eternity, she nodded. "What do you need us to do?" "Stay together. Stay quiet. When the fighting starts, follow Einar toward the eastern wall and don't look back no matter what you hear behind you." Alva handed the girl a small knife from her belt. "If anyone tries to stop you who isn't us, use this." The next building contained 47 adult captives, men and women from across the Northern Territories, united only by their shared misfortune of falling into the slave traders' hands. Unlike the children, they greeted their liberators with immediate understanding of both the opportunity and the danger. "How many guards?" asked a grizzled warrior whose scars suggested he'd been captured in battle rather than a raid on civilians. 20 in the compound, plus 8 more with Thorvald Bloodaxe who arrived an hour ago, Einar replied. "We have the advantage of surprise, but it won't last long." "Weapons?" Alva gestured toward a locked cabinet against the wall. "The guards' personal effects are stored there. Whatever you were carrying when captured should still be available. Plus anything we can take from the guards themselves once the action starts." The scarred warrior smiled grimly. "I've been dreaming of this moment for 6 months. Point me at the bastards who've been keeping us caged." As they opened the remaining buildings, their force grew to over 100 potential combatants, not all of whom were in condition to fight, but enough to create the chaos they needed. Word spread quickly through the growing crowd. "Wait for the signal," then overwhelm the guards through sheer numbers while the leaders secured the compound's exits. But as they prepared for the assault, Thorvald's voice echoed across the compound with unwelcome news. "Einar Ironhand! I know you're here, old friend. Show yourself, and we can discuss this like civilized men." The war chief had positioned himself near the main gate with his elite warriors, effectively blocking the most obvious escape route. His tactical experience was evident in how quickly he'd assessed the situation and moved to control the key terrain. "He's not going to let us walk out of here," Einar observed grimly. "No," Alva agreed. "Which means we fight our way out, or we all end up back in chains. Possibly with some of us decorating the compound's walls as examples to future troublemakers." She turned to address the crowd of freed captives. "Listen to me, all of you. This is your chance, probably your only chance, to reclaim your freedom. But freedom isn't free. Some of us may not survive what comes next. Anyone who doesn't want to risk their life in this fight can remain here and return to captivity. No one will think less of you for making that choice. Not a single person moved toward the buildings they just escaped. Then we do this together," she continued. "Adults form 3 groups, 1 for each gate, with the strongest taking the main entrance where Thorvald's men are waiting. Children, you stay with Einar and follow the plan we discussed. Everyone else, remember that we're not trying to win a battle. We're trying to create enough confusion to escape in the chaos." As the groups organized themselves, Einar found himself studying Alva with new eyes. The broken girl he'd rescued from Bjorn's stable had never really existed. From the beginning, he'd been dealing with a trained leader who'd been plotting her revenge while playing the role of helpless victim. The realization should have made him angry, but instead he felt a deep respect for the intelligence and patience required to maintain such a deception. "You never needed rescuing, did you?" he asked quietly. "Everyone needs rescuing sometimes," she replied, checking the edge of her stolen sword. "But rescue and revenge aren't mutually exclusive. Sometimes they're the same thing." Before he could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps indicated that their time for preparation had run out. Thorvald was bringing his search to them, likely having deduced their location from the process of elimination. "Positions," Alva commanded, and the freed captives melted into the shadows around the compounds. Buildings, the next few minutes would determine whether their desperate gamble succeeded or whether they all ended, up dead in a muddy field outside Skallvik. But as Einar looked around at the faces surrounding him, hardened by suffering, but lit with the fire of hope, he realized that the outcome might matter less than the attempt itself. For the first time in years, he was fighting for something that truly mattered. The war against the slave trade was about to begin in earnest, and there would be no retreat from the path they'd chosen. Victory or death were the only options remaining. "Here they come," someone whispered from the shadows. Einar gripped his knife tighter and prepared to discover which kind of man he'd become. The first clash erupted at the compound's eastern gate, where a dozen freed captives overwhelmed two guards with the desperate fury of people who had nothing left to lose. Steel rang against steel in the pre-dawn darkness, punctuated by shouts of pain and rage that echoed off the wooden palisades. The sound carried across the entire facility, alerting everyone that the moment for stealth had passed. Einar led the children toward the predetermined breach point in the northern wall, a section where the wooden posts had been weakened by rot and could be kicked through with enough force. Behind them, Alva coordinated the main assault with the tactical precision of someone trained in warfare from childhood. Her voice cut through the chaos, directing groups to exploit weaknesses in the guards' hastily organized defense. "Second group, hit the armory. Don't let them organize with proper weapons. Third group, secure the horses. We need mounts for the wounded." The scarred warrior who'd spoken earlier fought with the controlled violence of a professional soldier, his recovered sword singing through the air as he carved through guards who'd grown complacent from dealing with chained victims. Around him, other freed captives wielded makeshift weapons with deadly effectiveness: kitchen knives, broken tools, and fists hardened by months of forced labor. But the compound's defenders weren't helpless. These were experienced men who'd chosen violence as their profession, and they began to rally under the leadership of their sergeants. Arrow shafts hissed through the darkness, finding targets among the less cautious attackers. A woman fell, clutching her shoulder, blood seeping between her fingers. An older man staggered backward with a sword thrust through his thigh. "Move faster!" Einar shouted to the children as he kicked at the weakened wall posts. The wood splintered but held, requiring more force than he'd anticipated. Behind them, the sounds of battle grew more intense as both sides committed fully to the fight. Then Thorvald's voice boomed across the compound, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed in the midst of chaos. "Bring me Einar Ironhand alive." "Kill everyone else!" The war chief had positioned his elite warriors at the main gate, but now they began moving into the compound itself, their superior equipment and training immediately apparent. These weren't simple guards or hired thugs. They were professional killers who'd survived countless battles by being better, faster, and more ruthless than their opponents. A guard rounded the corner of the children's building just as Einar finally broke through the wall. The man's eyes widened as he took in the scene. 24 children streaming through the breach while a giant of a man stood guard with a blood-stained knife. He opened his mouth to raise an alarm, but 12-year-old Astrid was faster, burying the blade Alva had given her between his ribs with surgical precision. Well done, Einar said grimly, helping her retrieve the weapon. Now run! The children poured through the gap in the wall like water through a broken dam, their small size allowing them to move quickly through the pine grove beyond the compound. Einar followed, pausing only to ensure that none had been left behind. In the distance, he could see smoke rising from one of the buildings. Someone had decided that if they couldn't control the facility, they'd burn it rather than let it fall into enemy hands. Back inside the compound, Alva found herself separated from the main group, fighting a running battle through the maze of buildings with 3 of Thorvald's warriors. Her swordwork was exceptional, not the crude hacking of an amateur, but the fluid grace of someone who'd received formal instruction from masters of the craft. But 3 against 1 were poor odds, even for someone with her skill level. She gave ground steadily, using the narrow spaces between buildings to prevent her opponents from surrounding her completely. A thrust aimed at her heart slid past her ribs, scoring a line of fire across her side. Another blade whistled past her ear as she ducked under a horizontal slash that would have taken her head clean off. "Surrender now, and Thorvald might let you live," gasped one of her attackers. A young warrior whose overconfidence had already cost him a shallow cut across his sword arm. "Thorvald's mercy isn't worth the risk," Alva replied, launching a counterattack that forced all 3 men backward. Her blade found the gap in the young warrior's guard, sliding between his ribs with the soft sound of steel parting flesh. He fell with a look of surprise, as if he couldn't quite believe his life was ending in a muddy compound outside an insignificant trading town. The remaining 2 warriors pressed their attack with renewed fury, their strikes coming faster and harder as they realized they were facing someone far more dangerous than a simple escaped slave. But their anger made them sloppy, and Alva began to exploit the openings their rage created. Across the compound, fires were spreading from building to building, fed by dry wood and years of accumulated straw. The acrid smoke made breathing difficult and visibility even worse, but it also provided cover for the escaping captives. In the chaos, it was becoming impossible to tell friend from foe, ally from enemy. The revolution had begun, and there would be no stopping it now. Einar reached the rallying point in the pine grove to find the children huddled together, but safe, their eyes wide with the excitement and terror of their first taste of freedom. Young Astrid had taken charge of organizing the group, her natural leadership evident as she assigned the older children to watch over the younger ones while keeping everyone quiet and ready to move. The adults. She asked when Einar arrived alone. "Still fighting," he replied, scanning the tree line for signs of pursuit. "But they knew this might happen. The plan was always for you to reach safety first." Behind them, the compound burned like a beacon against the pre-dawn sky. The screams and clash of weapons continued, but they were growing more distant as the battle spread beyond the original boundaries of the facility. Some of the freed captives were undoubtedly dead, but many others had escaped into the surrounding countryside, where they could disappear among the forests and hills. A crashing sound in the underbrush announced the arrival of other survivors. The scarred warrior emerged from the shadows, supporting a wounded woman, while 2 other men carried an unconscious youth between them. Blood stained their clothes, and exhaustion lined their faces, but they were alive and free. "Alva?" Einar asked. "Still inside," the warrior replied grimly. Thorvald cornered her near the main building. "She ordered us to get the wounded out while she bought us time." The words hit Einar like physical blows. After everything they'd accomplished, after the careful planning and desperate courage that had brought them this far, Alva might die within sight of victory. The irony was bitter beyond bearing. The woman who'd orchestrated their liberation might not live to enjoy its fruits. "Take the children north," he said, handing his pack to Astrid. "There's a shepherd's hut about 3 miles through the forest. Wait there until full daylight, then make your way to the settlement at Nordvik. Tell them Einar Ironhand sent you, and they'll provide shelter until you can find permanent homes." "Where are you going?" the scarred warrior asked, though his expression suggested he already knew the answer. "Back for Alva. That's suicide." Thorvald's got 20 men still alive, and the compound is burning around them. You'll never make it out." Einar checked his knife and appropriated a sword from one of the dead guards they'd encountered during their escape. "Maybe, but I'm not leaving her to face him alone." Before anyone could argue further, he was gone, moving through the trees with the silent precision of his warrior years. The skills he'd tried so hard to abandon came flooding back. How to approach an enemy position without detection. How to read the sounds of battle and interpret what they meant. How to kill quickly and efficiently when stealth was no longer possible. The compound was a maze of smoke and flames by the time he re-entered through the breach they'd created. Most of the buildings were fully engulfed, their roofs collapsing in showers of sparks that drifted across the courtyard like malevolent snow. Bodies lay scattered throughout the facility, guards and captives alike, united in death despite their differences in life. He found Alva backed against the burning remains of the main storage building, her sword weaving patterns in the air as she held 3 of Thorvald's warriors at bay. Blood ran from multiple wounds, and her breathing came in harsh gasps that spoke of exhaustion pushed beyond normal limits. But her blade still moved with deadly precision, and her eyes held the fierce determination of someone who refused to yield. Thorvald himself stood apart from the immediate fight, watching with the calculating gaze of a professional evaluating another professional's work. When he spotted Einar emerging from the smoke, his scarred face split in a predatory grin. "There you are, old friend. I was beginning to think you'd abandoned your pet slave to save your own skin." "She's not my slave," Einar replied, circling to put himself between Thorvald and the other fighters. "She never was. No, I can see that now. Alva, Eric's daughter, unless I'm mistaken. I helped burn her father's hall, you know. Good raid, that one. Lots of silver and prime captives for the markets." Thorvald's smile widened. "Though I never expected to encounter his daughter again under such interesting circumstances." The casual admission of his role in destroying Alva's family sent cold rage flowing through Einar's veins. This wasn't just about freeing slaves anymore. It was about confronting the system of violence and exploitation that had defined too much of his own life. "Let's finish this," he said, raising his sword. "With pleasure," Thorvald replied. "Though I should warn you, I've learned a few new tricks since our last sparring session." The 2 former comrades began to circle each other, while around them the compound continued to burn. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the confrontation that would determine not just who lived and who died, but what kind of men they'd chosen to become. The final battle was about to begin. The duel between Einar and Thorvald lasted less than 30 heartbeats, but each moment stretched like an eternity. The war chief moved with the fluid grace of a master swordsman, his blade describing deadly arcs that would have ended most fights before they truly began. But Einar had learned his own lessons during their years fighting side by side, and muscle memory guided his responses, even as conscious thought struggled to keep pace with the violence. Steel rang against steel in a symphony of destruction, each strike powerful enough to shatter bone if it found unprotected flesh. Thorvald pressed his attack with the confidence of someone accustomed to victory, but he'd underestimated how much his former comrade had changed during their years apart. The man he faced now fought not for glory or gold, but for something far more dangerous, moral conviction. When the end came, it was swift and decisive. Thorvald overextended himself in a thrust aimed at Einar's heart, leaving himself open for the counterattack that slid beneath his guard and found the gap between his ribs. The war chief's eyes widened in shock as he realized his mistake, then grew distant as life flowed out of him onto the burning ground. "I'm sorry, old friend," Einar whispered as he closed Thorvald's eyes. But some friendships don't survive becoming better people. With their leader dead, the remaining guards lost their cohesion. Some fled into the surrounding wilderness, while others threw down their weapons and begged for mercy from the former captives who now held the advantage. Alva, despite her wounds, took charge of organizing the final phase of their liberation. ensuring that the compound's records were completely destroyed and any remaining prisoners were freed from their bonds. By full daylight, nothing remained of Ragnar's slave-trading operation except smoking ruins and scattered ashes. More than 80 people had escaped into freedom, carrying with them enough silver and supplies to begin new lives far from the reach of their former captors. The children were safely away, guided by adults who'd promised to see them settled in communities where they could grow up free from the trauma of their captivity. Einar and Alva rode north together as the sun climbed toward its zenith, leaving behind a legacy of fire and liberation that would echo through the trading networks of the northern territories. Word of what had happened would spread quickly. Slave dealers would become more cautious. Potential victims would know that resistance was possible, and other compounds might face similar uprisings as the example-inspired imitators. "Do you think we've made a real difference?" Alva asked as they paused at a stream to rest their horses and tend their wounds. Einar considered the question while cleaning a cut on his forearm. "We've freed nearly 100 people who would otherwise have lived and died in chains. We've destroyed one of the largest trading operations in the region. And we've proven that the system isn't invulnerable." He looked at her directly. "If that's not making a difference, I don't know what would be." She nodded, though her expression remained thoughtful. "But there are dozens of other compounds, hundreds of traders, thousands of people still suffering in captivity. What we did was important, but it was also just a beginning. Then we keep going," he replied simply. "We find other operations, free other captives, inspire other people to join the fight. One compound at a time, one person at a time, until the entire system collapses under the weight of its own contradictions." The magnitude of such a commitment should have been daunting, but instead, Einar felt a sense of purpose he hadn't experienced since abandoning his warrior's life years ago. The peaceful farmer who'd gone to Skallvik to buy a horse was gone forever, replaced by someone who'd chosen to fight for justice rather than personal tranquility. They reached his homestead as the afternoon shadows grew long, finding Ragnar waiting in the doorway with relief and resignation warring on her weathered face. She took in their battle-stained clothes, their numerous wounds, and the grim satisfaction in their eyes, and understood immediately that everything had changed. "How many did you save?" she asked without preamble. 87 people, Alva replied. 23 children, 64 adults. "All free now, all safe," Ragnar nodded approvingly. "And the cost?" "Thorvald Bloodaxe and his warband are dead. Ragnar's compound is ashes. The immediate leadership of the regional slave trade has been decapitated." Einar dismounted and embraced the old woman who'd been more mother than servant to him. "But we both know this is just the beginning." "I know," she said softly. "And I know you well enough to understand that you won't stop here. You've found your cause at last, haven't you?" Over the following days, word arrived of the chaos their actions had triggered throughout the trading networks. Other slave dealers were increasing their security or abandoning their operations entirely. Ships carrying captive cargo were being challenged by local authorities who'd previously looked the other way. Most importantly, groups of freed slaves were forming their own liberation cells, carrying the revolution to territories Einar and Alva had never seen. The war against the slave trade was spreading beyond anything they'd imagined possible. Standing in his courtyard as winter's first snow began to fall, Einar reflected on the chain of events that had brought him to this moment. A simple errand to buy a horse had become a mission that might last the rest of his life. The isolated peace he'd cultivated was gone forever, replaced by something more dangerous, but infinitely more meaningful. Alva appeared beside him, her wounds healing, but her resolve stronger than ever. "Ready for the next operation?" she asked. "Always," he replied, and meant it. Together, they'd discovered that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the personal cost. The broken chains that had started their partnership had become symbols of a larger breaking, the systematic destruction of a system built on human suffering. The giant Viking and the former slave maiden had indeed become something more than either had dreamed possible. They'd become liberators, and their work had only just begun. Freedom, they'd learned, was contagious, and they intended to spread it as far as their strength and courage would carry them.